I want to begin with something small, almost mundane, because the large truths usually hide inside the small numbers that nobody looks at twice. There is a line in the federal budget, and it grows quietly, and it is the amount of money spent simply to service the debt that already exists. Not new programs, not new ambitions, not investment in anything that produces a future, just interest on what was already borrowed. For most of my adult life, that line was an afterthought, a rounding error in the great machinery of a wealthy nation. Something you could ignore because the cost of carrying the debt was almost nothing. And now it is not almost nothing. It has crossed the point where it competes with defense, where it rivals the largest discretionary commitments a government makes, and it is still climbing. I find myself returning to that line often, not with alarm, because alarm is a poor lens for understanding anything, but with a kind of quiet attention, because it tells you something that the headlines do not. It tells you that the corridor of choices available to the people who manage the money is narrowing, and that the narrowing is arithmetic, not opinion. I want to be careful here, because this is precisely the kind of subject that attracts the worst thinking. There is a whole genre of commentary that treats the Federal Reserve as either a group of omniscient wizards who can engineer any outcome they choose, or as a cabal executing some deliberate scheme against ordinary people, or as the final domino before some cinematic collapse. I reject all of that, genuinely and completely. There is no collapse coming in the theatrical sense, no single day when everything ends, no secret plot that explains the numbers. What there is, instead, is something far more interesting and far less dramatic. A system under structural pressure, staffed by intelligent and mostly well-intentioned people, facing a set of constraints that no amount of intelligence or good intention can dissolve. And the most honest thing I can say is that the Fed has run out of good options, not because anyone failed, but because the options were always going to narrow once the arithmetic reached a certain stage. That is what I want to sit with. Not the drama, the structure. To understand why the options narrow, you have to understand what a central bank actually does. Stripped of mystique, it has essentially one lever with two directions. It can make money cheaper or it can make money more expensive, and it does this to balance two forces that pull against each other. When it makes money cheaper, it stimulates activity, it encourages borrowing and spending and hiring, and eventually, if it goes too far, it produces inflation, the slow erosion of the currency's purchasing power. When it makes money more expensive, it cools activity, it restrains inflation, and eventually, if it goes too far, it produces recession and unemployment. For decades, this was a manageable dance because there was room on both sides. You could raise rates to fight inflation without triggering a crisis, and you could lower them to fight recession without igniting inflation, because the debt load of the system was light enough that the interest rate could move freely in service of the economy. That freedom was the real luxury, and almost no one recognized it as a luxury while they had it. Here is what changes when the debt becomes large enough. The interest rate is no longer just a tool for managing the economy. It becomes a tool that directly determines the cost of carrying the debt. And those two purposes begin to conflict. Suppose inflation rises and the textbook says you must raise rates to contain it. But raising rates now means the interest cost on an enormous pile of debt increases with every meeting, and that rising cost feeds back into the deficit, which means more borrowing, which means more debt, which means the next rate increase is even more expensive. The lever that was supposed to serve the economy is now partly captured by the debt itself. Economists have a phrase for this condition, and it is worth knowing because it is precise rather than dramatic fiscal dominance. It describes the moment when the fiscal situation, the sheer weight of what the government owes, begins to dominate monetary policy, when the central bank can no longer act freely because its actions are constrained by their effect on the government's ability to pay its bills. The Fed does not announce this. It does not put out a statement saying, "We are now fiscally dominated." It simply finds, meeting after meeting, that the range of acceptable moves has quietly compressed. And I want to add the human dimension here, because the structure alone never explains why people fail to see these things until late. The reason fiscal dominance is hard to perceive from the inside is that it arrives as a series of individually reasonable decisions, each of which makes sense in isolation. No single rate decision looks like a surrender of independence. No single deficit looks like the one that changed everything. It is genuinely difficult for any institution or any person to notice the moment when the accumulation of reasonable choices has produced an unreasonable situation, because there was never a single indefensible choice you could point to. This is the same cognitive difficulty that keeps a person in a slowly deteriorating situation of any kind. The absence of a dramatic threshold means there is never an obvious moment to update your assumptions. And so the assumptions persist far past their expiration. The mind is built to respond to sudden change and to sleep through gradual change, and gradual change is precisely what compounds. Let me stay with the arithmetic a little longer, because it is the foundation everything else rests on, and because I find that most people feel the debt is a problem without ever having felt the mechanism of why it becomes a trap. Debt is not dangerous in itself. Debt is leverage, and leverage is neutral. It amplifies whatever it is attached to. When you borrow to build productive capability, to create something that generates more value than the cost of the borrowing, the debt is your friend. It is the very engine of growth, and a growing economy carries its debts easily, the way a strong person carries a heavy pack on level ground. The danger begins when the thing you have borrowed against stops growing faster than the interest compounds against you. At that point, the leverage reverses. It stops amplifying growth and starts amplifying the burden, and you enter a regime where you must borrow simply to pay the interest on what you already borrowed. And that is a mathematical spiral that no amount of clever management escapes, only defers. The interest compounds whether or not the economy grows, and that asymmetry, compounding on one side, uncertainty on the other, is the whole story in miniature. Now, faced with this, a system does not have infinite responses. This is the part I find genuinely clarifying, because when you strip away the noise and the commentary and the political theater, there are only 3 exits from an unsustainable debt load, and there have only ever been 3 across every civilization and every century that has faced this same arithmetic. You can inflate the debt away, meaning you allow the currency to lose value so that the debt, which is fixed in nominal terms, shrinks in real terms and is repaid in cheaper money. You can restructure the debt, meaning you default in some form, whether through an honest admission or through the 1,000 quieter mechanisms that accomplish the same thing without using the word. Or you can grow your way out, meaning you expand the productive capability of the economy so rapidly that the debt, while unchanged in size, becomes small relative to the wealth that now surrounds it. Inflate, restructure, grow. Those are the exits. Every other option anyone proposes is ultimately a variation or a combination or a delay of one of these 3. And once you see that clearly, the entire landscape of policy debate resolves into something legible. Before I take each of these apart, I want to name the deeper pattern, because this is where positioning begins. And positioning is really what this whole reflection is about. The people who navigate these transitions well are almost never the people who predicted the exact timing, because timing is genuinely unknowable, and anyone who tells you they know the schedule is selling certainty that does not exist. The people who navigate it well are the ones who understood the structure early enough to arrange their affairs around it before the arrangement became obvious and therefore expensive. There is a body of work that lays this out carefully, called the Naval Codex, and it is not a set of predictions or a market forecast. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who actually builds durable long-term wealth across changing conditions. The way leverage and ownership and specific knowledge interact to produce outcomes that look like luck from the outside and like structure from the inside. My suggestion is always to engage with the principles themselves rather than any conclusion drawn from them, because principles travel across circumstances while conclusions expire. You will find it linked in the description below, and there is a code on the screen you can scan to reach it directly. And with that, let me return to the three exits. Because understanding which one a system is likely to take tells you almost everything about where the pressure will land. Start with inflation, because it is the path of least resistance and therefore the most probable, and I want to be precise about why. Inflation is politically invisible in a way the other two exits are not. When a government restructures its debt, everyone sees it. There is a headline, there is a moment, there are identifiable losers who know exactly what happened to them and who to blame. When a government grows its way out, it requires decades of discipline and investment, and the deferral of present consumption, which is nearly impossible to sustain through the short time horizons of political cycles. But when a government inflates, the mechanism is diffuse and slow and hard to attribute. Prices rise a little each year, the currency buys a little less. The debt quietly shrinks in real terms, and there is no single villain, no single moment, no headline that says, "Today we chose to erode your savings." The erosion is distributed across millions of transactions and hidden inside the ordinary texture of life becoming more expensive, which everyone experiences, but few connect to a deliberate resolution of a debt problem. This is why inflation is the historically favored exit, not because anyone is evil, but because it is the exit that spreads its costs most quietly and most widely, and quiet, wide costs are the kind that political systems can survive. But I want to reject the simple version of this, because the simple version becomes a doom narrative, and that is not what I'm describing. Inflation is not a straight line, and it is not hyperinflation, and it is not the wheelbarrow of currency image that people reach for when they want to frighten themselves. What I am describing is something subtler and more persistent, a structural bias toward allowing inflation to run somewhat hotter than stated targets, for longer than stated commitments, not as a policy anyone will announce, but as the emergent behavior of a system that finds, again and again, that the cost of truly crushing inflation is a cost it cannot politically or fiscally bear. The tolerance for inflation rises. The willingness to inflict the pain required to eliminate it falls. And over a long enough horizon, that asymmetry does its work, slowly and then suddenly, the way these things always do, years of it barely registering, and then a stretch where people realize their savings have quietly lost a third of their purchasing power and they cannot quite say when it happened. Consider the second exit, restructuring, because it is the one people understand least and fear most, and I want to demystify it. Restructuring does not usually arrive as an outright default, because outright default is catastrophic to a government's ability to borrow in the future, and no sophisticated system chooses it if softer mechanisms are available. Instead, it arrives dressed in technical language and administrative procedure. It can look like financial repression, where the government uses regulation to force institutions to hold its debt at interest rates below the rate of inflation, so that the holders of the debt lose purchasing power slowly while the government's burden lightens a default by other means, spread across pension funds and banks and ordinary savers who never agree to it and often never notice it. It can look like the extension of maturities, the quiet renegotiation of terms, the gradual conversion of debt into forms that are easier for the issuer and worse for the holder. And I want to make the structural point clearly and without any accusation of bad faith, because none of this requires bad faith. When a debt cannot be paid in full on its original terms, it will not be paid in full on its original terms, and the only real question is which mechanism accomplishes the shortfall and who ends up absorbing it. That is not a moral statement, it is an arithmetic one. Which brings me to the third exit, growth. And I want to spend genuine time here because it is the only exit that is not a form of loss. The only one that resolves the contradiction by expanding the pie rather than redistributing the shrinkage, and it is, for precisely that reason, the hardest and the least likely under present conditions. Growth is the honorable exit. If an economy can expand its productive capability fast enough, The debt becomes trivial, not because anyone paid it down, but because the wealth around it grew so much larger that the old obligation is dwarfed. This is how healthy, young, dynamic economies escape their debts. They grow into a size that makes yesterday's borrowing irrelevant. And in principle, we live at a moment of extraordinary potential for exactly this kind of growth, because the tools of leverage have never been more powerful. We have code, which is labor that works while you sleep and replicates at zero marginal cost. We have automation and now genuine machine intelligence, which are forms of leverage that a previous generation could not have imagined. The raw capacity to expand productive capability has never been greater in the history of our species. And that is not hyperbole, it is simply where the technology stands. So why is growth the hardest path now, when the tools for it are the best they have ever been? This is the genuine paradox. And the answer is not technological, but structural and institutional. Growth of the kind that resolves a debt problem requires that capital and talent flow toward productive capability, toward the building of new things that generate real value rather than toward financial engineering, toward the extraction of value from arrangements that produce nothing new. And a heavily indebted, heavily financialized system develops a powerful gravitational pull in exactly the wrong direction. When money is cheap and asset prices are inflated by that cheapness, the highest returns often come not from building anything, but from positioning cleverly within the financial system itself, from leverage applied to existing assets rather than to the creation of new capability. The talent follows the returns, as talent always does. And so a great deal of the most capable human capital in a late-stage financialized economy flows into activities that rearrange ownership of what already exists, rather than into activities that expand what exists. That is the trap. The tools for real growth have never been better, and the incentive structure has rarely been more tilted against using them for real growth. The problem is not capability. The problem is the direction the capability is pointed. And this is where the individual perspective diverges sharply from the systemic one, which is the pivot I most want you to hold, because the system may be unable to change its direction while an individual within it retains full freedom to change his own. The system, taken as a whole, may find growth genuinely difficult, trapped by its own incentives and its own accumulated obligations and the short time horizons of everyone with power to change it. But you, as a single participant, are not the system. You can choose, deliberately and against the ambient current, to orient your own capital and your own energy toward genuine productive capability rather than toward the financial engineering that the environment rewards in the short term and punishes in the long. That choice is available to you no matter what the aggregate does, and it is, I would argue, the single most important choice available to anyone thinking about wealth across a monetary transition of the kind we are describing. Let me now connect the three exits to the two great classes of people who live inside every economy, because this is where the abstraction becomes personal and where positioning stops being theoretical. There are, in the end, two fundamental economic positions a person can occupy. You can be a saver, which means you hold your wealth primarily in the currency and in claims denominated in the currency, cash, bonds, the promises of others to pay you a fixed amount of that currency in the future. Or you can be an owner, which means you hold your wealth primarily in productive assets, in businesses, in equity, in real things that produce value and whose worth is not fixed in the currency but floats with the real economy. And here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth that ties everything together, every one of the three exits. In its own way, transfers wealth from the savers to the owners. Inflation does it most directly, eroding the value of currency-denominated claims while the productive assets that generate real value hold or increase their worth. Restructuring does it through the financial repression I described, forcing savers to hold claims that lose to inflation while owners of real capability sail past. And even growth, the honorable exit, rewards the owners of productive capability enormously while the pure saver merely keeps pace at best. All three roads lead to the same structural place. The owner of productive capability is protected across all three exits. The pure saver is exposed across all three. I want to be careful not to let this collapse into a slogan. because slogans are where thinking goes to die, and the slogan version, own assets, avoid cash, is both true and dangerously incomplete. It is incomplete because not all assets are equal, and the distinction between kinds of assets is going to matter more in the years ahead than it has in the recent past. There is a genuine difference between an asset that produces real value in the world and an asset whose price has been inflated by the very monetary conditions we are discussing. And in a period of monetary transition, the difference between those two is the difference between preservation and loss. This is precisely the terrain that most people get wrong. Because in the long, calm decades when money was cheap, the two kinds of assets moved together, and it was easy to mistake financial inflation for genuine productive value. Easy to believe you were an owner of capability when you were really just a holder of an inflated claim. There is a framework that traces exactly this, called Dragon Pivot, and it examines how monetary transitions have actually unfolded across history, how the shift from one monetary order to another, the slow reordering of reserve relationships, and the long arc of inflation dynamics has repeatedly created a window in which the difference between real assets and inflated ones becomes suddenly and permanently visible. It is not a prophecy of any particular event, and it is not a timing signal, because timing is the one thing no honest framework will promise you. It is a study of how these discontinuities have historically resolved, and how the people who understood the structure positioned their assets to carry their wealth across the gap rather than lose it in the crossing. The value, as always, is in absorbing the underlying pattern rather than any single forecast drawn from it. You will find it linked below in the description, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it if you prefer. And now I want to develop precisely that distinction between the productive and the merely inflated, because it is the hinge on which everything after this turns. Consider what a productive asset genuinely is at its root. It is a claim on real output, on the ongoing capability to produce something that people value and will continue to value regardless of what the currency does. A business that solves a real problem for real people, that has pricing power because it provides something genuinely useful, that can raise its prices as the currency loses value, because its value to its customers is real rather than nominal. That is a productive asset. And it is precisely the kind of thing that carries wealth intact across an inflationary transition, because its worth is anchored to the real economy rather than to the currency. Now consider what a financially engineered asset is at its root. It is a claim whose value derives not from producing anything new, but from the arrangement of financial conditions, from cheap leverage, from the compression of interest rates, from the multiple that a market is willing to pay when money is abundant and desperate for a return. When the monetary conditions that inflated it reverse, or even merely normalize, that value can evaporate, because there was never any real productive anchor beneath it, only the temporary chemistry of cheap money. And the tragedy, the genuine tragedy, is that in the calm years, the financially engineered asset often looks more attractive than the productive one. It rose faster. It felt more sophisticated. It rewarded cleverness over patience. This is the deepest reason most people position badly. They mistake the reward for financial engineering, which is temporary and conditional, for the reward for building real capability, which is durable and structural. I said earlier that I wanted to keep returning to the human dimension, because the structure without the psychology explains nothing about why people fail to act. And here is where the psychology becomes acute. Even a person who understands everything I have said, who follows the arithmetic and accepts the logic of the three exits and grasps the distinction between real and inflated assets, will very often fail to act on it. And the reason is not stupidity, it is the profound difficulty of updating a stable assumption while the stability still holds. For most of a person's economically active life, holding currency and currency-denominated claims felt not just safe but responsible. The very definition of prudence, the thing you were taught to do. To move from that position to the position of an owner of productive assets requires a person to override a deeply installed sense of what safety means, and to do so at precisely the moment when the old definition of safety still appears to be working because the transition has not yet become visible. That is genuinely hard. It asks you to act on structure rather than on appearance. To trust the arithmetic over the ambient feeling of normalcy, and human beings are built to trust the ambient feeling of normalcy right up until the moment it fails them. The comfort of the familiar position is the single greatest obstacle to sound positioning, and it operates most powerfully on intelligent people, because intelligent people are especially skilled at constructing sophisticated reasons to keep doing what feels comfortable. There is a particular quality to how institutions embody this failure, and I find it worth dwelling on because institutions are where the psychology becomes structural and therefore slow to move. Every institution is, at some level, an organism built to defend the conditions that gave rise to it. It accumulates people, incentives, and internal narratives that all point backward toward the world in which the institution succeeded. A large financial institution that grew powerful in an era of cheap money and financial engineering is genuinely poorly equipped at the level of its own instincts to recognize when that era is ending, because to recognize it would be to indict the very source of its own success and status. The people at the top rose by mastering the old game, and it is asking a great deal of anyone to expect them to declare the game they mastered obsolete. And so institutions, as a rule, defend yesterday long past the point where yesterday has quietly become the past, not out of stupidity or malice, but out of the ordinary human difficulty of dismantling the ladder you climbed. This is why the largest and most sophisticated institutions are so often the last to adapt to a genuine transition, and why the adaptation, when it finally comes, tends to come all at once in a cascade after years of denial slowly, and then suddenly, the same signature that runs through every part of this story. I want to draw out what I think is the single most useful principle from all of this. The thing that survives when the specifics fade, and it is this, that the resolution of a structural contradiction is not a matter of if, but of when and how, and that the reward flows overwhelmingly to those who positioned themselves before the resolution became obvious. When a system carries an internal contradiction of the kind we have described, a debt load that cannot grow forever, meeting an economy that cannot inflate forever without consequence, that contradiction does not simply persist indefinitely. Systems resolve their contradictions. They always have. The pressure builds along the path of least resistance until the resolution arrives, and the resolution is almost never announced in advance. Because if it were announced in advance, everyone would position for it, and its costs and benefits would be arbitraged away before it happened. The resolution rewards the early precisely because it is not obvious, and it stops rewarding the moment it becomes obvious, because obviousness is just another word for a price that has already moved. This is the deep reason that positioning must happen before conviction feels comfortable, before the evidence is overwhelming, before the ambient consensus has formed, because by the time the ambient consensus forms, the positioning is no longer available on favorable terms. The window is always widest when the visibility is lowest, and it closes as the visibility rises. And this leads me to the most practical distinction I can offer about how a person actually arranges their affairs through a period like this, which is the distinction between the structure of your assets and the mere selection of your assets. Most people, when they think about positioning, think only about what to own, which asset, which sector, which instrument. That is the shallow layer. And it matters, but it is not where the durable protection lives. The durable protection lives in the structure, in how your ownership is held, in the institutional and legal architecture around your productive assets, in whether your wealth is arranged to be resilient across a genuine discontinuity or merely optimized for the calm conditions that preceded it. It is entirely possible to own the right things inside the wrong structure and to lose most of the benefit. And it is the structure, far more than the selection, that separates wealth that survives a transition from wealth that merely rode a favorable era and then gave it all back. There is a framework devoted precisely to this called Sovereign Vault, and it addresses the architecture of building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, rather than in the financial engineering whose limits we have been examining throughout. It is not a product recommendation, and it is not a scheme. It is a way of thinking about the structure beneath ownership, the difference between holding something and holding it in a form that endures. As with the others, the value is in the principles, which you can absorb and apply on your own terms. It is linked in the description below, and the code on the screen offers a direct path to it should you want one. Let me widen the lens one final time before I bring this back down to the concrete, because I do not want to leave the impression that this is a uniquely modern predicament or a uniquely national one, since both of those impressions would be false and would distort the real lesson. This same arithmetic, this same narrowing of options, this same set of 3 exits has appeared across radically different societies in radically different centuries, and it would be a genuine error to attribute it to any particular culture or leadership or national character, because it is nothing of the kind. It is a stage in a trajectory, and any society that reaches that stage faces the same corridor of narrowing choices, regardless of its virtues or its flaws. I want to reject explicitly the temptation to make this about one nation being wise and another foolish, one culture disciplined and another profligate, because that framing is not only offensive, it is analytically wrong. It mistakes the stage of a trajectory for an essential quality of a people. Rome faced this in its own terms. Empires that held the reserve currency of their eras face this. The specific circumstances differ enormously, the technologies and the institutions and the vocabularies differ, but the underlying structure recurs because the arithmetic of compounding debt against finite growth is not cultural. It is mathematical. And mathematics does not care about the flag. What we are living through is an old truth. Wearing the specific clothing of our particular moment and recognizing it as old rather than novel is itself a form of clarity, because it frees you from the panic of thinking something unprecedented is happening and returns you to the calm work of understanding a familiar pattern in an unfamiliar dress. There is something almost consoling in that recognition, and I want to name the consolation honestly rather than leaving it implicit. If this were genuinely unprecedented, if no one had ever navigated it before, then there would be no accumulated wisdom to draw on, and every decision would be a blind gamble. But because it is old, because the structure has recurred across history, there is a genuine body of understanding about how these transitions unfold and how individuals have carried their wealth and their families and their productive capability across them intact. The transition is not the end of anything. It is a passage, and passages have been made before, and the people who made them well were not the ones who predicted the exact hour, but the ones who understood the terrain and prepared their footing while others were still insisting the ground was solid. The equanimity I keep returning to is not detachment and it is not resignation. It is the specific calm that comes from understanding that you are inside a knowable pattern rather than an unknowable catastrophe. And that knowability is precisely what makes intelligent action possible. So let me return, as I promised, to that small line in the budget where I began. The quiet cost of carrying the debt that already exists. Because I see it differently now than I did when I started. And I suspect you might too. It is not a number to fear. It is a signal, a piece of information about the stage of the trajectory we occupy and the direction the pressure is building. It tells you that the corridor is narrowing, that the 3 exits are the only exits, that the honorable one is the hardest and therefore the least likely, and that whichever combination the system ultimately takes, the burden will fall on the savers and the protection will accrue to the owners of genuine productive capability held in durable structures. None of that requires alarm. All of it rewards attention. The difference between the person who is harmed by a transition and the person who is preserved through it is almost never a difference of information at the moment of crisis, because at the moment of crisis, the information is available to everyone and therefore useless to everyone. The difference is a difference of positioning established quietly in advance in the years when the signal was visible only to those who chose to look, when the arithmetic was legible but the consequences had not yet arrived. I keep coming back to the phrase because it is the truest thing I know about how these resolutions actually occur, slowly and then suddenly. The slowly is the long stretch we are in now, the years of narrowing options and rising interest costs and the gradual erosion that almost no one connects to a coming resolution, the years in which the comfortable position still appears to work and the familiar definition of safety still seems to hold. And the suddenly is the compressed period, whenever it arrives, in which the accumulated pressure resolves along whichever path was always the path of least resistance, and the world reorganizes around the new reality faster than most people can update their assumptions. The whole game, if it can be called a game, is to do your thinking during the slowly, so that you are not forced to do it during the suddenly. Because thinking done during the suddenly is thinking done in panic, and panic is the worst possible condition under which to make decisions that will shape a lifetime and perhaps generations beyond it. I do not know the timing, and I want to end by saying that plainly, because anyone who claims to know the timing has told you something about their honesty rather than about the future. I do not know whether the resolution is near or far, whether it comes as a slow grind of inflation over a decade or a sharper reordering in a shorter span, and the not knowing is not a weakness in the analysis but an honest feature of it. What I know is the structure, and the structure is enough. The structure tells me that the options have narrowed to 3, that the 3 fall unevenly on savers and owners, that the distinction between real and engineered value will matter more than it has in living memory, and that the reward, as it always has, will flow to those who understood the shape of the thing before its shape was obvious to everyone. That is not a prediction. It is a recognition of a pattern old enough to be trusted, dressed in the particular circumstances of our own moment, and the only genuine question it leaves open is not what will happen, but whether you will have done the quiet work of positioning before the quiet becomes noise. Systems resolve their contradictions. They always have, and they always will, one way or another, slowly and then suddenly, and the resolution has never once waited for the unprepared to be ready.